welcome everyone to the last session of the day. We thought you might all be outside enjoying the sunshine or getting a beer in rather than coming to listen to us.
We did try and get them to project us to the fountains, but
yes,
they preferred the music.
Yeah. Right, so let's get going. So, my name is David Postlethwaite. I work for a company called Banking Circle as a DBA. It's a financial services company based in Copenhagen. We've also got offices in Luxembourg and Munich. I've been working as a DBA, SQL and Oracle for at least 15 years. Now I'm doing not just DBA work, but I'm an Azure admin, I'm a Power BI admin, I do automation, I do PowerShell. In fact, anything my company throws at me now. We have a saying in my company, if in doubt, give it to David, he'll work it out and we'll know what to do. So that is me.
And I am G.Ellis. I'm from the UK. Me and David have been friends for a very long time. We worked together probably 10, 15 years ago in a company called LV. As I said, I'm based in the UK. I run a small consulting and training business there. I've had a variety of jobs in my time, from report writer to web developer many moons ago in classic ASP, and I kind of fell into SQL Server administration from there. And for the last 15 or 16 years, I've been running my business. We do lots of different things like data architecture and design, upgrades and migrations, cloud migrations and the like as well. And we do offer some training in that space. Now, my email's on there, my LinkedIn profile's on there. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, please do reach out and connect. I am on Twitter or X, or X formerly known as Twitter, or whatever it's called. I don't really use it as much as I used to, if I'm being completely honest with you. But we'll get started on how to protect our SQL servers and why it matters. But before we do, just a quick shout out to the sponsors of this fantastic event. This is my first time speaking in Poland. I visited previously to go to a NATO base to do some work for. It was actually the Polish Army. That was a few years back. It's my first time talking at a conference here, and as you can see, it's really well organised, really well run. Hopefully you've all got your wristbands and stuff for the party later on. All this happens because of the sponsors that contribute to make this a great event. So before we get started, just a big shout out to those and a thank you. Thank you from me and David for having us as well.
Yes, thank you. Now, before we get going, I'm just interested to know how many people here had heard of the CIS benchmark before they came to this session?
Few hands.
Oh, a few of you.
Not many.
Okay. How many of you have actually used it? Right, up the front. You can. Well, a couple of years ago, I hadn't heard of it either. I hadn't heard of the CIS benchmark at all. And then one day, one of our security team came to me and he said, here's the CIS benchmark. It's 120 pages long, and we want you to implement all the recommendations that are in there on all your SQL virtual machines. And I went, okay. So I took the 120 pages, I had a quick read, and I went back to him and said, this is quite interesting. So you want me to stop using the SQL agent from sending emails when something goes wrong, because SQL agent could be used by a hacker to send out information externally. You want me to hide the SQL instance so that no one can find it on the odd chance that a hacker might find it. And you want me to change the default port from 1433 so no one can connect to it anymore, because a hacker will be looking on port 1433. And you also want me to turn off SQL authentication so none of our Python scripts can connect. I think we need to have a talk, because if we do that, no one's going to be able to connect to any of our SQL databases, and that's not particularly good.
Or particularly useful.
Yeah, so that's where I came from, and that's where we will move on.
Now, David may have pitched that in quite a negative way. He didn't really mean to. Right? It's not as bad as he has made out there. The benchmarks, they've come from an organisation called the Centre for Internet Security, which is where the CIS bit comes in. And they produce benchmarks for many different products. SQL Server is one, but lots of different IT systems. There's a Windows one. Those are all really about locking down and hardening your environment as best you can. Now, they are available for SQL. There's a Windows version. There's several others as well that you can use and utilize. For non-commercial use, they're available free of charge, and you can get them in PDF format. If you want to use them commercially, and there's a grey area in terms of what that actually means, there is a cost, but you get some additional stuff if you're paying to use them. But they're basically there's kind of a forum and a benchmark, and it's consensus based. So people to go in and discuss and talk about these best practices around hardening their SQL servers. The guides get developed and they get accepted, and then lots of businesses use them. Now, I first come across them about 8 or 9 years ago, where I had a client, an insurance company in the UK, that were looking to, they had a very vast SQL Server estate, and it hadn't been managed or looked after very well, and they were trying to secure them as best they could. Now, some of the stuff David alluded to then, like changing the port, for example, there were things to consider before you went doing that across a large sort of enterprise estate, and things you needed to configure. But they are becoming, well, I've seen them becoming more and more accepted, particularly in outside the SQL Server sphere, in the sort of Windows realm. And there are versions going back all the way to 2008. And when I implemented this initially, how we checked it, we'll talk more about that in just a second. I had a PowerShell script that was thousands and thousands lines long. It's now it's much easier to do that now. But the latest version, SQL Server 2022 and SQL Server 2019, they get updated for each release. I think the 2019 version is something like 103 pages, and the version that we've got here is 115. It gets divvied up into different sections, and we'll talk about each of those sections as we go through this course. I think the joke I normally make here is this is kind of something out of Pirates of the Caribbean and Barbossa, where he goes, they're more guidelines than strict rules you need to adhere to, and each environment might be a little bit different. And if you're not laughing at my jokes now, we're going to be in a little bit of trouble come the end of the day. But there we go.
But you can get them for not just Windows, you can get them for mobile phones, for Apple, for
Office
web browsers, for Office, for anything. They're not just a SQL Windows thing for Mac.
Now, what we're looking at here, it's SQL Server on Windows, isn't it? It's not; these are not related to Azure-based SQL products.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, my initial thoughts weren't quite as bad as I made out, but I think the list as we go through them will get you thinking, because there were all sorts of things I saw and thought, oh, I never thought of that. That's interesting. Maybe, and then we had to change them. So before we delve into looking at all the different things in the CIS framework, I want to ask you a few questions. So are you actually protecting your SQL servers? Have you gone through and looked at what you need to harden to make them secure? Or have you just left everything on the defaults? And what are you doing to actually protect them? What have you done up to now? Have you looked at all the default settings in SQL Server and checked that they're not compromising your system? Because if they're not secure enough, we're going to have a problem. Are we doing enough? That's the next question. Are we doing enough to make sure? Are we actually looking at what's in there?
Just before you move on, David, just a quick show of hands from the crowd here. Has anyone ever suffered a security incident related to their SQL Server? So what I'm thinking about is, has anyone ever experienced a ransomware attack on their SQL servers? No. Okay, that's good. It's just me then. Not me. I was doing some work for a consultancy that if they stuck or implemented some of these policies, that ransomware attack that did end up disrupting their business quite significantly would have had much less of an impact if they'd adopted these procedures, and they do now. They've learned their lesson.
Next question. Are you actually checking? If you've actually hardened your systems, are you going back and checking that they are correct? Has a junior DBA, or in my case Terraform, gone and reconfigured your SQL without you realizing it, and suddenly it's not doing any backups? Or someone's changed the settings so XP command shell is suddenly available when it shouldn't be, because someone's run a query and not turned it off when they've finished. So you need to be going back and checking as often as you can. Because if we're not checking our systems, as Gethyn has just said, and reducing the risk, then we're open to attack. You know, there is a chance that someone's going to break through your firewall or whatever and get onto your systems. And if we get attacked, we're going to lose data. If we lose data, our companies are going to lose money, they're going to lose their reputation, maybe the company will go bust, and ultimately we're going to lose our jobs. So it's really important that we are protecting everything. And this is where the CIS framework comes in. It's a great place to start to look at how we harden our system. As we said, they're defined by all sorts of people in the industry, security experts, auditors. Everyone has come up with this. It's not just Microsoft inventing something. Lots of people have been involved to come up with these things, so they're a really good start. And whilst they're not a regulatory requirement, our auditors are probably using them. If you work in finance like me, you have auditors that come along, they don't have a sense of humour whatsoever. So you must make sure that when you're talking to them and they start looking at the CIS framework and go, have you done this? That's probably what they're going to use to check that your system is secure so that you can carry on trading or selling or whatever you do. So it's definitely worth having a look. But they're only for security. They don't make your SQL go any faster. They just keep it safer. Right, Gethyn.
It's on me, is it? Next, please. Next slide, please.
Oh, no. Oh, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
It hasn't clicked over, has it?
No, not yet.
There we go.
It still hasn't, David. Should I do it with your mouse?
No, there we go.
Right. This is on you.
It's on me again.
Yeah, it's on you again.
So what we're going to do, sorry, Laurel and Hardy show at the moment, we'll attempt to go through as many recommendations as we can in the next 50 minutes. And we want to hear from you whether you think it's a good idea, whether you're actually doing it or not. So we want to get some sort of interaction going, so it's not just
us talking. So it's not just us talking.
Not just
and
us.
Really, I'd like to get a feel for the ones you agree or disagree with as well, because I'm sure there'll be some in there that you will disagree with. Next slide, please, David. So let's have a look at what one of these look like. As I mentioned, the document here is split up into 8 sections, and each section has got a list of recommendations and frameworks, and they all follow a reasonably similar pattern. Now, the one we have on the screen there is from section 2, so 2.9, and it says, ensure trustworthy database properties is set to off. Now, they all have a similar structure. They will have a description. So the description for this one is what configuration items need to be looked at, and it's basically is the database property trustworthy, set to off, and under certain circumstances that can mean that database objects can access objects in another database under certain circumstances. Now, I think the one call out I'll just talk to you, well, just mention here. Right, if you go to the next slide and put the rationale on for me, David, please, the next bullet.
Yeah.
It provides protection against malicious code or CLR assemblies or stored procedures running from one database to another. So it's trying to take away that availability, so that threat in theory then goes away. Next slide, please. And the next point, please, David. Now, so you've got the description, the reason why you're doing it. Then there's the audit. So how do we check? Now, there's a little script for most of the recommendations. There's a SQL script, right? So if you want to check whether it's enabled or not, it'll provide that for you. And I think it's just a select against some of the SIS databases there. Next slide, David. Just click over. Yeah. So just note on here. It says where trustworthy equals 1, a name not equal to MSDB. Okay. So the benchmark is saying turn it off, yet it's on for MSDB, and it's on for MSDB because MSDB relies on Service Broker, and Service Broker needs that turned on to be able to use it. And the results, you would expect no results to come back from that query, no rows returned, but if they do, you can go away and work out why. Now, it might have a legitimate reason. You would then need to go away and investigate. So when I implemented this for this large insurance company, we had to then work out where it was going against the framework and understand if it was needed, and then work out if we could take it off or turn it off, and we've managed to do that sort of across the board. Next slide, please, David.
Or you record it for the auditors to say, we need this on, and this is the reason.
Yeah, so just to fill that out a little bit, for my insurance company, if it was on and needed to be on, we had to take it through a security design authority, an SDA, to get approval for it to remain on. And if they said no, you had to turn it off, then we turned it off and everything broke. Generally, they were fine, but it just needed to be documented and audited. And then there is remediation. So what we need to do to fix it. So in this case, it's an alter database statement set trustworthy to off, and you'd obviously replace the database name in there. Now, the default value here is off. It'll be off by default. So someone must have come along and turned it on for a reason. And as David alluded to, that could be for any number of reasons, particularly perhaps not so much in a production environment, although I'm sure we all have security models in production that could do with a little tightening. But perhaps in a dev environment where developers have got high level of permissions to change these settings, and sometimes people do it not by mistake, but they've gone and changed it because they think it's helping them achieve something, and they've changed the wrong setting. And sometimes they can just be historical. If you've inherited a database that was developed 25 years ago, which I've got experience of, they can have various different legacy settings that have come forward as a direct result. So it's off by default, but if it is on, maybe understand why.
Right, let's go back to the beginning and start taking a look. So the first section is called Installation, Updates and Patches. And the first one is ensure that the latest SQL Server service packs or hotfixes have been applied and are up to date. So how many people's SQL servers have the latest cumulative update on them?
3 out of 45.
No, there's a few more hands going up. So
define the latest. That's okay.
We'll come on to that. Yeah, so
that's a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most obvious one. We all agree we should be patching our Windows, our SQL, and everything else. So I think it goes without saying. But as you say, always wait a month or so before you apply it, so that everyone else can find the bugs in the patching before you put it on your system.
There are various, there's something called Cyber Essentials in the UK in particular. You actually have to be on the latest cumulative update or service pack to get that accreditation from whoever sends that out. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I think it's more the ability of doing it regularly as opposed to being on the latest version.
Now, I got a little poll here. How many of you still apply your service packs and cumulative updates manually to your production systems? And how many of you have an automated process that just chucks it in on a Sunday afternoon and you hope the system's still running Monday?
A couple of people.
So what do the rest of you do? Not patch anything?
Don't do it.
Okay, so you just apply it automatically to everything?
No, in the company I do work for, they get applied to non-production on one weekend, and then 2 weekends later they get applied to, there we go.
Yeah, because historically we've always patched, Windows gets patched automatically by SCCM or whatever, but even going back to when I worked in the UK, we would go in on a Sunday and apply the service pack or the CU manually, reboot the server and make sure it came back up and was still contactable by all the applications that needed it. Go on. Okay. So we got Ola is using SCCM per patch. I'm thinking that we should be looking at trusting the patches a bit more. Now they're cumulative updates rather than the massive service pack, that I should stop wasting my Sundays, especially with the lovely sunny weather we have in Denmark. It's snowing.
Yeah, but it'll be the end of your overtime though, David, so you've got to balance it up.
Yeah. Okay, so the second one, ensure single function member servers are used. Basically, your SQL Server should be the only thing on that box. You shouldn't have any applications running it, is what they say. Now, we've done that for a long time because we know the SQL Server grabs all the memory, so therefore we shouldn't have anything else running on it. But their logic is if you've got a web server running on there or an app server running on the same thing, that's another entry for someone to attack and get onto the box and get onto SQL. So they recommend, for that reason, that you shouldn't have anything else on your SQL Server virtual machine. It should just be the SQL Server and nothing else. But I would imagine everyone runs their SQL Server alone on the server, nothing else is on it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's SQL.
No, but that goes against this, because I had to get, it's not SQL, I had to get permission when I was doing this from my SDA to say I could have reporting services on it, and they said no initially, and then I explained the cost of a license for the new server, and they then were quite happy with report server running on the box.
Yeah, so
You still don't? No.
You put it separate.
I split it if I can. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's reasons for memory and also for what the CIS is saying.
Right, so this is back to me. So section 2 of the document is all about reducing the surface area, and there's lots of different things in here that you can turn off. It basically turn off if you're not using, and it's kind of common sense stuff. If you're not using it, don't install it. So I inherit servers sometimes that have got the database engine installed, analysis services, reporting services. Nobody's using any of those. It doesn't make sense to install them just because they're going to chew up resources, never mind security. But there are different ones in here that I'm struggling to read here. So 2.1 is distributed, ad hoc distributed queries in your SQL Server. A lot of these relate to the configuration settings. So these configuration settings, they're controlled by sp-configure, and there's sys configurations you can run a query against to pull these out. And there's various things in here like ad hoc distributed queries. Right, this allows users to query data and execute statements in external data sources. If we turn it off, so because the feature is used to remotely access and exploit other vulnerabilities on remote SQL Server instances, you can run perhaps unsafe VBA functions and other things. So generally, I'm in agreement with this. If you're not using it, turn it off. I believe it's off by default.
Yeah.
Or if you need to turn it on, do what you need to do and turn it off again. Don't leave it open all the time. Then there's a turn off mail XP. All right, so stop SQL sending emails, and that's, I think David alluded to this earlier on. You could use the agent as a spam bot or a denial of service type threat. I think we've both had experiences where turning that off, if you've got quite an expensive monitoring tool that can do some of this work for you, it's great. If you don't, you can end up in a bit of trouble. So I don't want to steal your story, David, but when I left the insurance company we both worked for, I'd set up a whole bunch of jobs and didn't change the owner. And they came along and disabled my account, so all the backups stopped working. Now that was fine because they weren't sending emails in the first place, were they, David? And so you didn't get alerted you didn't work it out for about 2 weeks that your backups hadn't run, and you went and changed the job so you would get email alerts. So you know that might be something you want to do. The other one on there is XP command shell. If you disable that. It's actually, that's been in the guidelines for years. It's been removed in the latest version.
Does everyone understand what XP command shell does? So it basically allows SQL to run a DOS command.
You access it.
Yeah. So it's a very high privilege, but it's not actually in the CIS framework anymore. It was in previous versions, but it's not mentioned anymore. But that's probably the most dangerous thing that you could enable. So that's a bit of a strange one as to why it's been dropped.
There'll be a reason for it. I can't remember what it is. I did work that out years ago, but
sorry, we can't hear you. Have we got a microphone?
A little bit more secure. I knew there was a reason for it. I couldn't remember what it was either. Right. Right.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Cool. What someone's just said is that XP command shell is now more secure than it used to be, so it's not just a little bit, but we still recommend that you check for it and make sure it's disabled so that it can't be used for anything
that's only
malicious.
for SQL Server 2022. In 2019, it's still, or did it?
No, it was just it's missing from the 2019 one as well.
Okay.
So it seems to have disappeared.
Next slide, please, David.
Okay, so surface area reduction. So here's a few that we have. Ensure remote admin server configuration is set to 0. So this is our famous DAC. Does everyone understand what DAC is? So the idea with the dedicated administrator connection, if your SQL Server has a duff query that suddenly sends the CPU to 100%, you can't then get on the box to be able to stop it because it's 100% and it's not used. So the DAC is a special connection that allows you to connect even though the server is not responding, so that you can then kill the connection. But it's a very high privileged account. What the CIS is saying is you shouldn't be able to do this remotely. Use the DAC to get on it. You should RDP to the server, then use the DAC locally. But if the server's running at 100%, you can't RDP to it because it won't respond. But they consider using the DAC remotely is unsafe because it's a high privileged account if you use it to connect. But it runs on a different port, so it's not on 1433, it's on 1434. So what you could have is a dedicated admin server and set up the firewall rules so that is the only one that is allowed to connect on that port and keep it safe. And in that way you could have the remote connection. And that's what we've looked at, that 1434 is only available from one sort of admin server that if we ever needed to be able to connect using the DAC. So
there's ways around it.
Yeah, so that's how we've got around it, so we can keep it because it is really useful if your Windows or SQL Server has gone to 100% CPU and you can't actually get on the box anymore. The next one, scan for startups procs. So if you didn't realize, you can actually set up stored procedures to run when SQL starts up. The recommendation is to turn it off because someone could put a malicious stored procedure in there that truncates all tables or something when SQL starts. I actually use it though. I actually get, when SQL starts up, I have a stored procedure that records the service accounts into a table. So I have a record of what service accounts were being used when it started up. So if something went wrong, maybe someone went in at the weekend, thought they'd have a little fiddle, change the service account to something else so they could hack into it, I would be able to see that that happened at that time and then maybe look through the Windows log to find out who was doing it.
I think you're right. Okay. So if you're using replication, you're not going to be able to do that then. So if going back to my case, I would need to go to my SDA and go, well, we're replicating this year. Can I? Yeah.
So we
need an exception for it.
Yeah. So
it's dependent on it. Yeah. As that dependency.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next ones are about the SA login. Anyone still using SA? The recommendation: disable the SA account, rename it, set it to a random password and never use it because it's unsecure. Yes. The rename is because what's a hacker going to try and log in as? SA is the obvious. Okay. Okay.
The ID doesn't change. It's the same. It's the same SID.
It's just maybe hackers don't look for the ID; they only look for the login name. So by renaming it, it's not so easy to find it. And
this, I guess, this adds into the sort of secure the different layers of security that you can have, and hopefully it just slows them down enough for you to catch them.
Yeah. And the final one is, don't create another login called SA. I actually have a user, when I started the company, there wasn't a very good policy for naming accounts. So someone joined called Sarah something. She got an account called SA. It causes all sorts of trouble. So try and avoid, make sure you have login names that are longer than 2 characters in your naming standard. Right, Gethyn, over to you.
Right, so there's a few more. These are all to do with surface area reduction. They're all kind of related and they're all kind of off by default. So the first one there is ensure cross-database ownership chaining is set to 0, so therefore it's off. This can be useful if you've got, well, this gets used really when you have databases have got a tightly coupled relationship. Right, so where objects in one are dependent on one in another. So say you've got schemas that are split across different databases, there might be a need to have that on. It is off by default, but when it's turned on, it can lead to sort of unintended privilege escalation, which is the problem it's trying to fix. And again, if you're using it for a reason, there might be a valid reason. There might be lots of reasons for using it. It's just understanding if it's on. There are these potential vulnerabilities that you can bring in. There's OLE automation procedures, right? And again, this is if your SQL Server is interacting with various different Windows components, right, it can be a reason to turn them on. Right, but again, it exposes SQL Server to external operations that can potentially execute harmful actions on the server. So it's it's a good idea for it to be off. And then the remote access bit, which I don't think is the same thing David was just talking about. Right, it's not to be confused with that at all. But this would allow sort of stored procedures to be executed remotely on another server. And again, these are generally legacy based, so where I've encountered these being turned on, they've been on for a very long time, probably unnecessarily turned on, and they can be turned off.
There are some quite obscure things in this document. There's things that you've
for sys catalog. No, I've turned this off with no issues at all.
I'm glad. As long as we don't end up in a fight over. Yes, it should be. No, it shouldn't.
The difficulty is, and the point's valid, is it says to turn them off, but if they're on, they're going to be on for a reason, and you might not know the reason. Like I didn't on a lot of these, so you have to then go and dig and go, right, is anything using it? Is it going to cause me any issues with it off? Now, how I approached implementing this was I took the dev servers first, worked out what I thought I needed, and then set the configuration to be that way, and then just waited for it to break. And then before I actually got anywhere with that, I'd actually make it into test or UAT, set them there, and I'm like, oh, this actually needs it, because I don't think we've talked about TCP shared memory and those bits, but we turned all those off, and I didn't realize that if you're working on a server, you actually need shared memory to connect to SQL Server. It's like, oh, this doesn't work when I work locally, but it works fine when I'm on the TCP IP, but I'll come back to that in a bit.
Okay, we've still got quite a few to go on surface area reduction. So the next one, these are all our CL. Does anyone actually use CLR? Oh, we have oh wow. I've never used it, ever. So we have a number here that cover the CLR stuff. So ensure CLR is set to 0 unless you're actually needing it. Trustworthy is the example that we used, so make sure that is off unless your server is actually needed to be trustworthy. And then there's one called CLR strict security. Again, set that to 1 unless you have a good reason. But as I don't really use CLR.
For future versions of this talk, David, the people who put their hand up then, what do you use CLR for? What's it doing? Can you give us like a high level, non-NDA breaking reason, or what you're using them for? Lot of reasons. just one. Anyone will do. One that's not functions, regular expressions. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So all the things which are now coming into SQL 2022. Okay.
Cool. That's just interesting to know. Cool.
Okay. So that covers the CLR. If you're using them, great, but make sure these are configured the way you need them. If you are using CLR, or have justifications to your auditors when they come in and find that you have them turned on.
Oh, it's me again. Right.
Yes.
I stole my own thunder there. Turn off unnecessary protocols. So shared memory, name pipes, and TCP protocols. Just use the ones that you're using. So when I first came along here, I turned off, I need TCP IP, left it at that. Took shared memory off, and someone came to me and said, I've just RDP'd to the server and I can't connect. And I'm like, well, that's strange. You could work around it, but shared memory was the reason. I turned that off, and that was the reason people couldn't connect. But the least protocols, right? There's this. It's all about reducing the attack surface area. What else do we have on there? 2.11 is configured on non-standard ports. Does anyone do that? Has anyone changed the default port? A few people. I've done this for many. There's arguments either way with that one for me. It does slow it down. So going back to the sort of security by layers. it won't take them long to find the port or do a port scan if they're in. And I guess his arguments that does it slow down people enough to warrant changing it. I think I'm always quite happy to do it, so I do that. David moans a lot about changing the port. Right, but again, it's just slowing down the attack surface area. What else do we have on there? We've got ensure hide instance is set to yes for your production SQL servers. This was David's joke at the start about we want to hide it to everybody so they can connect. It just means it's more difficult to discover. Doesn't mean it won't discover it, but
does anyone hide their servers?
I did. Just me.
Just you.
Yeah. We went through the whole thing, and then nobody could find it. It comes back to this thing. What else do we have? The sort of standalone instances we were talking about, and then auto close set to off.
Does anyone use contained databases in SQL?
On premises. Nobody.
Did anyone ever try contained databases when they first came out?
Yeah, I tried them.
Yeah, so I don't know if anyone's ever worried about that because I'm not sure contained databases ever took off. As we see, no one's used them, so I guess it's never been. But
you probably have auto close off anyway because it'll cause you no end of hassle down the road. So there's even if your database isn't contained.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So back to you, David.
Hey, a new section. Finally, we got through all that. Section 3: authentication and authorization. So the first one is they recommend you set your SQL Server to Windows authentication only. Now, I had a colleague back in the UK that was insistent that we set all our SQL servers to Windows authentication only because it was much more secure. We had a slight problem with that because we had applications that didn't support Active Directory. So therefore, if we'd done that, they wouldn't have been able to log in. So we didn't do it on. There was a couple that we could configure to keep him happy, but generally, if you've got SQL logins, you can't turn this off. But SQL logins aren't quite as secure as Active Directory, so if you're not using Python or something that's using SQL logins, then it's worth turning it off. Interestingly,
I think the key here, though. Sorry, David, just to interject, because I've got a customer who their sort of standard procedure is to use Windows authentication, except where they don't. And you end up raising exceptions for lots of different things. I think here, though, sometimes that's come out of where it's needed is fine, but sometimes people are just lazy, and that's just how it was done before. So it's like, we've just got a SQL login, we'll keep using it. And they're usually the people who are using SA for a very long time, and then you come along and say you can't use SA. It's like, well, I need a username and login so one gets created. So I think it's a little bit of bad governance in my experience anyway in that space.
Yeah, we're pushing to try and get rid of all the SQL logins we can, just because they're not as secure as Active Directory. Interestingly, if you set this so it's in Windows authentication only mode, it doesn't stop you creating SQL logins, and it doesn't stop you from trying to log in using that SQL login, and the error message doesn't tell you that you can't log in because Windows authentication is the only method. And I have fallen foul of this a couple of times where I go, why the hell can't I log into this? And then eventually I've got, oh yeah, it's still using Windows authentication mode, so I couldn't use it. But the error message doesn't tell you that.
Because that would give someone who's trying to log in the knowledge that it's in Windows authentication mode.
Yeah, so just watch out for that. If you're trying to log in with a SQL login and it's not letting you in, it might be because SQL logins aren't allowed anymore. This one, ensure connect permissions to the guest users revoked on all SQL Server databases. I guess we're not using the guest user for anything, and by default it is disabled, so there's nothing else to worry about there. Does anyone actually use guest? I think that's just something left over from SQL a long time ago.
I use guest on some of my training classes, and it's got a whole bunch of permissions, but that doesn't adhere to any of these lockdown procedures.
Yeah. Ensure orphan users are dropped. I hadn't actually thought of this one. This was quite interesting. I thought, I don't actually check my SQL machines to see if there's any orphan users on them, but they consider this another potential attack by having logins that don't have or users that don't have logins attached. So I now have a job that runs every Sunday evening that just goes through all the databases on all the servers and just sends me an email saying if there's any orphan users on any of the systems. And this SA account that we talked about, this lady, if you've got a SQL virtual machine in Azure, the Azure service that runs inside Windows keeps adding her in to the MSDB database for some reason, and I have to keep deleting it. But I have found there is an orphan user built into Windows, into SQL. This user exists in the MSDB database, and it's there by design. So there's actually, Microsoft have actually made SQL Server have an orphan user. I've found this on all my SQL virtual machines in Azure. So whether it's an Azure thing, I'm not sure, but it turns up. So I had to change my job to ignore this particular one, so the auditors will be happy, because the auditors only look at the results, not how I got to them. Sorry, I missed that. Oh yes, yes. I insist on AD groups wherever, but if you've got a SQL account that's got left on a database and been deleted from the server, then that's how you end up with the orphan. But yeah, I refuse to allow Active Directory users to go on. They have to go via an AD group or an AAD group now, or whatever they call it these days. But yeah, sometimes there's just things, as has someone deployed something and left the user lying around which shouldn't be there. Let's just double check. And again, I have to run it to keep the auditors happy. A lot of this is just to keep the auditors off your back. So SQL authentication shouldn't be used on contained databases. No one uses contained databases. I'm not worried about that. And finally, ensure your service accounts aren't using a local admin account, because that's really bad. If you're running SQL Server on a virtual machine, I'm hoping you're using group managed GMSAs, group managed service accounts to run your SQL servers, because that's the most secure way of doing it. They can manage Kerberos. If you're using a group managed service account, you don't know what the password is, you never know it. Active Directory manages it for you. It's the most secure way to run your SQL servers. Yeah, so, and again, SQL Server full text service account shouldn't be an administrator. Why they've put that one as a separate item, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, generally you shouldn't be running your service accounts as a local admin or a system, those system accounts that exist. Yeah, because if you've got the browser service runs as local system, which then gets flagged up by CIS as being invalid because it's a local system account with too high a privilege if you need the browser service running. But probably most of you don't need the browser service if you just have one instance per server.
Okay, so over to me. More on authentication. I'll make this a bit quick because we're getting a little behind here. If you're working on legacy stuff, you might remember the old built-in administrators group, and it added those in by default. The SQL Server doesn't do this any longer when you do the install, but on your older versions, and back when I was doing this, I had lots of SQL Server 2005 still going then. That group was in there, so we needed to remove some of those. Local Windows groups shouldn't be used as logins for a SQL Server instance. We touched on the group thing earlier on. Using Active Directory groups is generally a path I would like to follow. And then the public database role is in every database. There's on there 3.11. Yeah. Ensure the public databases role in MSDB is not granted access to the SQL Server agent proxies. That will allow all users to utilize that proxy, which can end up with high levels of permissions. So click over, David. Next slide. All right. So this is section 4. So we've gone surface area reduction in 2, latest updates, single member server in 1, authentication in 3, password policies in 4. Now it's contradicting itself a little bit because it says try not to use SQL logins, and then it says if you're using SQL logins, do this. Right. But you can, if you are using SQL logins, you can get it to pick up the password policy from the server, and it can enforce things like password changes, password complexity, password history, those types of things. Now, David uses his for Python. I've got a whole bunch of Kubernetes stuff that needs a SQL login to connect. If it's running a service account like that, again, forcing the password to change can cause things to break. So there are things to consider there. And I definitely run into this issue with when I did this the sort of very first time. We had to get an exception raised for anything that was using let's call it a service account, which is what we called it. Whether that's the right term, I'm not 100% certain. But it's not as easy to implement this as you see fit. And if you've got your normal users logging and connecting to SQL Server, it's really easy to make them use Windows authentication anyway. Yes, no, it is. That was what I just said.
Yeah,
I agree with you completely. It's if it's an account for an application, it's not possible. Yeah, you're right. So how we did that, we forced everybody to change their password. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. So again, use this with some caution if you're doing it yourselves.
Yeah, it's most likely that this will be an exception to your auditors. But interesting, I didn't realize you can run a query against all your SQL logins and you can see whether these were set when the login was created.
Or the password changed, yeah.
Yeah. Right, few more.
Sorry, was there a question then? Sorry. No, okay. Sorry, my bad.
Auditing and logging.
We've got one question on the chat. Can you use an Azure Key Vault and some process to regenerate passwords to handle login changes without breaks?
Ooh, obviously a Key Vault could hold a password. I don't think.
I don't know is the answer off the top of my head.
I guess the SQL Server, the virtual machine, could have permissions to get to the Key Vault. And the Key Vault, can Key Vaults regenerate passwords? Or automate creation of a new?
I don't know, I use them for certificates.
Sorry?
No.
Yeah, I don't think SQL Server yet can talk to. Yeah, you could write some PowerShell or something that would go and create a new password in the Key Vault, pass it through PowerShell, and then update SQL. Yeah, PowerShell does everything.
PowerShell for the win, as you'll find out in a minute.
Yeah. Right, auditing and logging. This is an interesting one, and I had to do this on all of my systems. So the maximum number of log files that you have in your SQL log file is only a few. I can't remember how many it is now, and it doesn't say in my notes. Which
Six.
Is
6 is the default.
So 6 is the default. CIS recommend that you have like 12 or more, because their rationale is if something has attacked you, you may not find out for several days or weeks. If you've only got 2 or 3 log files, they've probably been rotated and you've lost the information. So they recommend that you have at least 12. They're big. You know, we had to increase the size of the disk to hold the number we wanted because they're all huge, so that you could then look back maybe 2 or 3 months if you needed to. Yeah, I hadn't thought of this at all, and it was like, oh yeah, it's an interesting point. We should increase the number of log files that we're storing so that we can look back further than we wanted to. Default trace should be enabled. That's so that we can, it actually collects all the information we want. It's on by default anyway. Then failed logins. In SQL Server, that screen you get when you configure, do you get it to write the failed logins and the successful logins to your SQL log file? Obviously you should have the failed logins turned on so that it's actually recording any failed logins.
They used to, I'm sure in the standard in previous versions, it actually suggested you capture failed and successful. So you can see all the fails and actually see if anyone got in. But I think now it recommends doing that in a different place, doesn't it? So it doesn't overwhelm your log with every successful login that you get.
Yes, I've only collected failed logins for a long time. If you're collecting successful logins, your SQL log will fill up very, very quickly if it's a busy.
But you do need to be able to establish if they've got in.
Yes. So what they recommend now is that you use the SQL Server audit feature to create the necessary audits to log and record the failed and successful logins. And just so that you are aware, so this is what we used to have: failed logins, successful logins. So now we just use the failed logins option, but in audits inside your security feature you can now create as many audit specifications as you want. So we've got, thank you, successful logins, failed logins. I create DDL changes, permission changes. We also have one in our company. We have an external supplier that looks at all the logs off all the Windows, the Unix, everything. So we have a job here that actually writes all the successful and failed logins to the Windows security log, and this company is scanning the Windows security logs and taking them and then running whatever algorithms they do and reporting back if there's anything strange in it. And they'll come back within 10 minutes and say something strange, or an hour or so, and something strange has happened on your SQL Server. Are you aware of it? It's quite difficult to get it to work. You have to do all sorts of jiggery-pokery in the registry and stuff, but once it's working, it will write information into the Windows security log, and then we use this company called Mnemonic. They are constantly scanning all the logs. They take them to their company, they scan them all, and they'll report back really, really quickly if there's anything in there, which is a really good way. But SQL audit specifications is the way to go to record that. I actually go further than that. I have an agent job, so I'm collecting all this information as well. So it'll email me, which is why I like emails. So I've created all these agent alerts, so that if logins can get created or disabled or someone changes a password, I get warned about it. I even have some extended events, so successful login and the failed login as well. So I have an extended event running, because extended events are a lot easier because you can query them like a table or a view. So therefore you can get the information back sometimes a lot easier just by going select star from the view that you've created. So I'm capturing it in all sorts of different ways, and these capture different information to the audits. I think the problem I saw with the audit is it doesn't tell you what the application is that's collecting. It tells you the successful login or the failed login, and sometimes I want to know what the application is that's connecting, because we look for applications that are still called .NET SQL Client, because we insist that in the connection string you have application name. If I see something coming in as .NET SQL Client, it could be a hacker who's just written a program and not put a proper connection string in, and you can get that out of the extended event, which is why belt and braces everything I can to make sure they're safe. Now, application development. We're nearly at the end now. This is almost the last section. Do we have any application developers here, or are you all DBAs?
Oh,
okay.
Few hands.
Okay.
You're going to offend them now, David. You're going to.
No, I'm not. I'm not. It's quite simple, really. Ensure that your application user input is sanitized. You're all doing that. You're doing required field validator. When I was a .NET developer, we were using required field validators in ASP.NET, avoid dynamic SQL, use parameterized queries, store procedures. You can even go as far, if everything is a stored procedure, then all your accounts need is execute permissions. You could remove the insert, update, and delete permission. Everything has to go through a stored procedure. That's
I've done that.
A way of really locking it down. And test everything. Don't just throw it in. That's what they're saying. And the second one is another CLR. Assembly, make sure your CLR is safe if you're using CLR. Yeah. Yeah. So developers, you get off quite easy compared to all the DBA ones that we've been looking at so far.
Oh, and it's over to me. Now I'm not going to spend too much time on these. Right, this is encryption. So make sure you're using the right algorithms to set to a certain level or higher. It's all in the document. For your non-system databases, make sure the asymmetric key is set to be greater than 248 in your non-system databases, and when you back up your databases, make sure they're encrypted as well. And then at the bottom there, it talks about the SQL browser service. Make sure that's set up and configured correctly. The reason I'm going fast here is I know we're down to 5 minutes left, and I want David to show you the fun stuff. Now, just before what's the easiest way to check this, right? Now, when I first implemented this the first time, I had about 2,000 lines of PowerShell that would go away and do this for me. And there used to be a scoring matrix in there, so if it was on, you got 1, and if it was off, you got none. And if you got to a certain score, then you were the winner for the day. But has anyone come across DBA checks before? Part of DBA tools, few hands going up. If you haven't used DBA tools, right, go and have a look at it. But as part of that, there's a module called DBA checks, and they can check for your adherence to the CIS benchmark. And it literally is a few lines of PowerShell, which I don't know if David's got set up on here, but if you have, we can put it on the screen. Don't worry if you don't, but we can make this available online afterwards. But you just put your list of servers in, set the configuration you want, and it'll go away and check whether you're adhering to the different CIS tests. And you get a nice little Power BI report after that you can put up and display to show how you're adhering to it or not. Now, DBA checks I use for a lot of different things, including my sort of daily check routines and other stuff for disk space, disk size. But this is in there, and it really is very good. Yeah.
DBA tools, if you've never used it, go and look up DBA tools. It's a massive PowerShell suite where you can do just about anything.
And Tracy Boggiano has got a really good blog post talking you through how to set this up as well, hasn't she, David? That you can.
So if we get time, we can just demonstrate that. But that's the thing. So what's missing? There is a small mention of encryption, but there's no talk about forcing encryption in your connections. There's no talk about transparent data encryption. There's no talk about having certificates, creating a certificate for your encrypted connections, or anything about always encrypted. It's not mentioned at all as a way of ensuring that your system is secure. It doesn't talk about high availability and disaster recovery, which hopefully you all have in place on your production systems in some way or another. There's no real talk about backups other than make sure your backup is encrypted. If you're using TDE, it will be encrypted anyway. Restore checks, probably the most important thing I do is that every Sunday in the quiet time, overnight, my SQL servers will restore the latest backup using DBA tools, and it will double check that it can restore the latest backup, and it does that every Sunday, and then sends me a report, which I then file away for auditors and everyone else. We don't get that, and again, there's no mention of the alerts and monitoring and some of the stuff that I mentioned that I do. So there's still stuff missing that we still need to do that the CIS isn't mentioning, and that's some of the stuff we've talked about. Okay, so we've run out of time.
Well, we've run out of time right at the end of our thing, which is quite good,
Yes, which
David.
is perfect.
We've timed it to perfection, is really what you should have said there. So thank you all for coming, everybody. You hope you found it useful. We'll make the slides available through GitHub and the website as well. If anyone wants a copy of this, they can take the 122 sheets of paper that David is modeling here. If anyone wants to
come have a look, it's here. If you want to take it away, I don't want to take it back on the plane to Denmark. But yeah,
otherwise we'll recycle it.
Yes, we'll recycle it. So
cool. Well, if you've got any questions, shout out. We've asked as we've been going along, though. But otherwise, thank you very much, guys. Much appreciated for coming along. Last session of the day.